Hello again.
Hello.
So, thanks for joining me again. And so, last time we covered a lot of ground, probably way too much ground, but I think that's good. We got like a general um, overview of the territory we're thinking into, which is what does um, Buddhist and Eastern philosophy have to tell us about ourselves and what we want in relation to this I guess, renegotiation of sense making and attempted planning with increasingly advanced AI, where people don't know what world this is or what world it even ought to be, and we're trying to get our bearings. And so, um, the world's wisdom traditions could be a good thing to think about what they had to say, especially those that really focused on crafting themselves and evolved as psychological technologies, such as Buddhism. But it's more complicated in that these religions co-evolved and there's a broader context that's required for actually really understanding what they say and what they mean, like the hermeneutics project requires that context. And so enter you with um uh
Hmm.
who has that knowledge, and I am mining your brain. So
Very happy to be mined. If you can find anything, go ahead.
so we talked a little bit before about the nature of the Bodhisattva vow
Yeah.
and the different ways it's related to within Buddhism. And there's we didn't get so much into like the range of conceptualizations of the idea of the Bodhisattva um, as an ideal, but um, that's something to approach. And so I guess what might make sense is for us to start anywhere, but as we go to explain more terms in terms of helping more people to come along for the conversation and the exploration. So,
Sure.
um,
Well, let's see. I mean, I'm in terms of bodhisattvahood, as I recall last time we were talking about. I guess I always think, um, maybe the main points are a uh, to sort of grasp how strange and seemingly unmotivated the bodhisattva vow can seem in the context of early Buddhism, which I think is important. In other words, it first hits you as this sort of ridiculous, unmotivated thing, right? So in the context of early Buddhism, why would anyone vow uh, to remain in samsara when they have the option to leave it? And so, in terms of the kind of mythos of Buddhism as it's originally set up, it's presented as this almost like religious mystery, almost sort of like, the cross or something, right? Somehow somebody did this. We know it happened because we have a Buddha, because it's sort of the mere facticity of a Buddha, that someone made this choice not to take the easy way out. And right, so it's important to get that paradoxicality front and center in order to kind of appreciate the boom of the move. Yeah, which is to say, don't forget, on the original conception, there's always this kind of worry. If you're really free of suffering, you're also free of uh, of co-suffering, of sympathy, of compassion, right? The fully sort of realized arhat would have no reason to care if other sentient beings are suffering. It would seem, if they don't even care if themselves are suffering, in the sort of physical sense of pain, why would they care? Why would anyone? And even if you care now, if you knew, this is one of those problems that came up, that there's something you could do to after which you would no longer care, why does one choose not to do that? And so that's point one about the bodhisattva. It's a lever to get to something, that is structurally wrong with that picture in early Buddhism, which is to say, that there is a remnant of a kind of unreconstructed self idea in the notion of ending suffering in any limited sphere whatsoever. And I think, I tell me if I'm wrong, but I think this point has been well grasped and is not one of those places where we're skipping steps, right? That self-interest is already other interest, right? Given the crucial non-self premise, myself or my future self, right? So that real arhatship in its sort of purest form should mean I don't even care what happens to me tomorrow. I would be unaffected by anything, any possible state of affairs. But the ineradicability of that, even in the solution to it, is what is sort of the springboard to bodhisattvahood, right? Do you want me to say that try to say that in another way?
Well, I'll try to paraphrase some things and see if I'm getting it right. So the setup of this problem of suffering and suffering from our situation of desiring things, and then the world being bigger than us and those desires, and there being more causes and conditions than we have control over for their satisfaction, placing us into a state of insecurity, kind of fundamental insecurity, and so like the in terms of a liberation from suffering and from desiring not to suffer, there's a a path, a noble path is laid out, but eventually though, as you go down this path, you get into these issues of paradoxes such as desiring not to desire, or you're desiring to, one of the ways in which you relinquish your desires is you realize the things like the truth of a no self perspective, or an atman, where it's like you see yourself as being more process, more ephemeral, more contingent, and this helps you like let go of the burning coal of your suffering. But then once you do that though, the question then would be, wait, well, once you dissolve the self, why did you care in the first place? And so there was a sort of like self-undermining setup there. And so,
right.
so then this then is the opening to, it's not just you in the narrow sense, but it's all the suffering and broadening the conception of suffering and of identification to being all the sentient beings. And so now, what do we mean by sentient being? So this guy kind of attempted going back to the basics. That seemed like a good.
Yeah, sure. Right. Something that's always stressed, right? There are no sentient beings to save, and yet, right? And yet I vow to save them all, right? There are no truths to learn, and yet I vow to master them all, right? That's sort of the form of it. And I mean, as I say, that's not avoided, that's really pushed, because, I would like to say that that fundamental sort of Mobius strip like paradox, right? That the more you press into out of the realness of any self, the more you've expanded the notion of the conventional self. Right. So, which is to say, there is, you have all along been arbitrarily identifying something as yourself. So now, as a bodhisattva, you're in the position not to eliminate your illusion, but to use your illusion, as they say, and to, in a certain way, even expand your illusion, but knowing your illusion as illusion. So, kind of embracing the illusion of selfhood. But when you embrace the illusion of selfhood as an illusion, you've also opened it up to multiple selfhoods. So the second thing to say about a bodhisattva is, of course, that the main thing about them is not only that they vow out of compassion, a compassion which is really just an expansion of their knee-jerk love of their own care about their own welfare, dislike of suffering. And we should further break down suffering, as you just sort of did, right? It really just means multiple causes, multiple effects, no single continent, fully sealed off result can ever be guaranteed. So, but in addition to that expansion of self-care into omnicare that comes with this kind of virtualization of the self, there's this idea of transformation, which I think maybe is important in this context, right? Infinite transformation based on what? Based on these interactive situations with other sentient beings. And other sentient beings means other beings who are suffering and have delusions, which, you are never from now on just their delusions. And in a way, that's one of the sort of highest hurdles here, right? You may already see the truth, so-called, but you're not free of untruth ever, or you're not free of illusion ever, because the truth that you see is just a way of relating illusions to illusions, maybe put it like that. Delusions to a delusions, which is another way of saying perspectives to perspectives, partial views to partial views, distortions to distortions. So, even the Bodhisattva's view in a certain way is a delusion, but it's one that has seen both that it's a delusion and that it's an unavoidable delusion, and in so seeing opens itself up to not only interfacing with, but even sort of embracing and in embodying, inhabiting other delusions. I prefer this to sort of a truth falsehood model when thinking about bodhisattvas, which is just to say, okay, there's certain things that are true and there's certain things that aren't true, which sets us back up into a kind of conditionality problem, like any dualism or any dichotomy, because any truth that is dependent on its contrast to an exclusion of falsehood ends up being in the same kind of insecure position, which is to say, is a form of suffering. The Buddhists like to say that the embrace of views, the clinging to views, that the mind, you've probably heard me say this a lot of times, right? But you have eyes and ears and nose, and they all like certain objects that they like to caress and fondle, and the mind has them, and those are views. And I
Affects.
mean, including views that you regard as true. So, you're going to end up with a position where you do have an idea of truth there, but it's going to have to be a truth that can equally express itself in terms of, in the guise of its opposite, and in terms of any determinate content that's there. So with the example, I think we may have gotten into it last, I can't remember, but self and non-self, right? By the time you get to the Nirvana Sutra, I think the one you just read, the milk medicine example, right? There's this idea that, well, true non-self is neither self nor non-self, which means also it can express itself either as self or non-self. I don't know if that pertains to the question of agency we were just talking about off camera, but which when you want to unpack it means the true non-self is not the absence of self, it's the illimitable multiplicity of selves and their intersubsumption. So that means that last phrase means you can occupy your own petty little self, but you have to occupy some delusional conditioned self. But a non-self type of self is a self that both sort of coexists with other selves and also inhabits the agency coming at you from the other side as well as your own. Not eliminates agency, but diversifies it and de-simple locations it, if you like. So you end up with all these different agencies going on at every specific locus.
So some backtracking and paraphrasing.
Yes.
So the Arhat ideal of Hinayana, like with little vehicle, or Theravada, and sitting at the feet of the elders, but the old Buddhism, this ideal just escaping this wheel of rebirth and becoming and suffering, but then now with this when that desire just to not suffer hits this opening of the self, seeing its the ways in which it's interdependent in its constitutively, and in terms of like to even self at all, requiring a certain type of continuity, and even a kind of like ill-formedness as a prerequisite of having any form at all. So like, was it
Yeah.
like, it's only because dharmas are empty that there can be form.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's only because you can be, and so like this, I'm thinking of like ideas from like Taoism and like your recent translation, but this idea of the uh, foregrounds requiring their backgrounds, like the, like this there to be any coherent gestalts. But in terms of so I guess so the Buddha's eye view would be one of so usually in a two truth model associated with Mahayana, or like greater vehicle Buddhism, uh, as they might call it, the two tiers. So one is the way we talk normally, dualistic, carving things up, this and that, this and not that, and then this then though, so that's one relative truth, the way we talk and coordinate, but then this other view that brings in to account like the multifariousness of things, so much so that categories are no longer hold in the normal way. You see that you're seeing the contradictions of things, and it's, and sometimes it might be the absolute truth, the view from the Buddha, something like beyond categorization or conceptualization, just suchness, and that this being like the prime reality. But then with Tiandai and your interpretation of it, there's a additional move made of taking both these truths, showing that structure as being necessary, and adding a third kind of truth that
Yeah.
brings to the fore this entanglement between it's not the right word, but between absolute and relative truth. So maybe like going into like the basics of Tiandai for people in terms
Oh,
of
gosh.
three truths.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's try to do that. Right. So yes, I mean, this is painting. We'll do this in sort of broad strokes, but a couple ways into this. First of all, as you were saying about two truths, I think that's important, right? Um, Broadly speaking, okay, the original two truths model has a
One quick
criterion of,
thing though, before we
yeah,
do, it's just, and part of, to remind people listening, part of what's motivating this is we're asking questions of like, what is an agent? Uh, what are
yeah,
core requirements for it? What are the core requirements for there to be purposes or meanings or goals?
yeah,
And ways in which attempting to realize goals, and what ways are these menaced under what circumstances? And so, for instance, like we, one could talk of a view of like of something like a bodhisattva, something like of uh, a empowered benevolent being helping others as like an ideal of something like that, maybe not framed in those terms of what we might want for an advanced AI to relate to us as something that would want to help us out with our suffering. But then the question is, well, what would you need for that? Does it have to be an agent itself? Can it serve that functions? And so like in terms of what you're just saying is sort of like, for instance, like part of the bodhisattva setup is the way to, like, you're forced to take on delusion just to be able to do your job. You have
yeah,
to be able to get into the thick of it and the mess of it to understand
yeah,
who are you helping, how are you helping them. And so then this would potentially suggest for you know if we want something to help us out in these ways, it might have to be an agent. In some ways it might have to at least pass through phases of being
yeah.
an agent like us. Anyway, so we're getting into all these complexities of like
Uh-huh.
what might we need, and what might we want. And so now
Right. No,
so
that yeah, go ahead. I mean, well, I mean, I was going to say that's a super important point, and we kind of talked a little about it, but I mean, right, the bodhisattva has to have suffered, right? point one, and actually never stopped, right? Because the further he gets along on the path, the more his embrace of multifarious forms of suffering plus an additional thing. It's not erasing suffering, it's suffering with a certain supplement, which we can talk about, right? So I was going to say, I can use the traditional sort of Tiantai setup here, right? There's the four teachings. And they would go, they call it, the first is the Tripitaka teaching, and they will say, that's the idea that all dharmas, real time, arise and perish. They're conditional. They have multiple causes, multiple effects. They're suffering. They're non-self. And those are the first two noble truths, right? The rising of suffering and the causes of the arising of suffering. And then there's nirvana and the path to nirvana. And those are also real time, real ending of those things, right? And they call that the analytic emptiness or the arising and perishing Four Noble Truths. Basically, for simplicity, we can just say this sort of mutual exclusivity of samsara and nirvana. So that's old style Buddhism as they summarize it. The second one is kind of emptiness teaching. They call it the shared teaching. Stop me, Adam, anytime if this goes too fast, but there's just a little rubric. And you can look, I have a little chart of this on the SCP article on Tiantai if people want to look at it visually.
Let's
But
like,
yeah, go ahead.
I'll put that in the notes. And I mean, maybe a little bit later, a little bit of historical background on
Yeah,
like Buddhism, just in terms of like most people haven't heard of it. Why?
yeah.
That they
Oh,
were
yeah,
massacred at some point.
sure,
Um,
sure. No, well, they have, but I mean, all the Japanese Buddhisms actually came through Tendai. But we can get into that later. And what happened in China is a little different, but we can get into that. Anyway, shared teaching. So what's that in its really formulaic form? Emptiness of all things. They are empty as they are. They are nirvanic in their nature, meaning they never arise or perish, meaning there is no self-nature that arises or perishes. So no definitive essence, independent entity ever comes into existence and then perishes. And this is where we set up this two truths thing, because obviously it looks like things do, right? And so we end up having to say, well, okay, if you understood correctly through these logical arguments that Nagarjuna gives us, you'd see that it's just logically incoherent to either say cause and effect are the same, or that they're different, or that a thing and its marks are the same, or that they're different. And so you simply have an inadequate set of categories when you are talking about self-natures of any kind of entity at all. So
and
that's
then,
ultimate truth. Yeah,
so
yeah,
I think you might have mentioned me before, like you view somewhat like um Aristotle as like this heart of darkness and source of like mental instability in like the philosophical tradition. So in a way, we're like forcing us into these like
yeah.
dichotomized views and basically
Oh, yes.
setting us up like at odds and like reifying our categories without realizing it, and not realizing like and basically robbing us of a kind of necessary psychological and spiritual flexibility that we need just to like get along in the world and make sense of anything. But like, so for Nagarjuna, Nargaj, how do I say his name? I
I
should.
say Nagarjuna, yeah, but
Gotcha, I'll go with you. He'll talk about, for instance, like a fourfold breakdown of the way you would
mm,
conceptualize things or not of both. Was it the thing being and its negation, the thing being true and its negation being false, the thing being false and its negation being true and both being false,
right.
and finding a way to like view all coherences in those terms, and to like whatever you're grasping at conceptually, actually showing how you can have this fourfold breakdown of which includes like coherent meanings, but also shows the ways like they fall apart on you in another
Well,
context.
well, let me just actually, the affirmation of all four is something more typical of Jainism in India, and whereas Nagarjuna will generally give you none of the four, right? He wants to say in ultimate truth, none of the four. Now the next question is, what about conventional truth, right? And here's where things get interesting. So the problem with the early Buddhism from this point of view is that it made nirvana, the unconditioned, into something conditioned just because it had to start at a particular moment in time, right? And therefore it depended upon the condition of certain practices happening, or it's happening only to one particular person. Whereas something truly unconditional could not be limited to any particular locus or time. That's really important to grasp here, right? Because being limited to it just happening one place rather than other is a condition. It has to be then and there for it to be happening, if you like. Being anywhere else, being another time, conditions it. And in this sort of very thoroughgoing way of thinking about suffering, that makes nirvana just another suffering. And basically speaking, there's a dualism between suffering and non-suffering there, between nirvana and samsara. What's wrong with dualism, right? Well, and that goes sort of back to your Aristotle question. Maybe dualism is just the way it is. Knowing the truth would be to know dualism. The Buddhists don't think so, because a dualism for them implies a conditionality. This is not that, as you said, right? A bivalence, mutual exclusivity. And the sort of founding paradox there is that if there is this mutual externality, mutual exclusivity, either state is in an insecure position. It is possible for the other state to supervene it, right? Now, you might just say, Buddhists are crazy. That's just how it is, man. You know, you get something good, you're going to have to fight to protect it. And that's just the price of doing business, right? And it is, right? And so it's going to be a long way around where Buddhism, I think that's a valid thing to say to Buddhists. But I think if you look at the development of Buddhists, they have a way that uniquely plays that problem because of the thoroughgoingness of, if you like, their nihilism in the opening gambit,
You,
right?
I want to later. I want you to get into dolphin worlds that you
Okay.
discuss, emptiness and omnipresence. But I feel like that, like,
Sure, I'll get to that one when we get to the Bodhisattva. That's great. That's important. Yeah. So anyway, so there you have this dualism between samsara and nirvana. The next step, the shared teaching, the Mahayana, and particularly kind of Madhyamaka or Nagarjuna teachings, say all things are already nirvana. Nirvana, there's no difference between nirvana and samsara, right? So there, that should solve the conditionality problem about nirvana. There's nowhere that isn't nirvana. Everything that you think arises already is quiescent. And that's what nirvana means, right? There is no suffering that arises. Some people may know the Heart Sutra, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. There's no difference between the two, and there's no suffering, there's no arising of suffering, there's no end of suffering. However, what happens there? Well, you have to get a two truths structure there, right? If you saw things correctly, you'd realize this very world is nirvana, but you don't. So what do we say? Well, it's not that there's any ontological change, it's an epistemological change, let's say, right? And that means there's now not the disjunction between samsara and nirvana, between suffering and liberation, but between truth and delusion. And already in the Nagarjuna or in two truths theory, they will say, well, it's not really a dualism, actually, it's a means ends relationship. So Buddhism always had this idea of the raft, right? Which is all these propositions, all these practices, they're not ultimate in the sense that when you reach nirvana, you have to abandon them. This is crucial to your question of a moment ago about purposes and agency, right? Because early Buddhism has a really important model there that continues to have implications. It says, basically, agency is the problem, man. Purposes are the problem. Purpose is just a fancy word for desire, after all. So it's because you have purposes that this whole thing is all messed up. And by the way, no purposes can ever really be fulfilled. It says, you're spinning plates with your purposes. So there's your problem. However, yes, as you mentioned ago, you're going to have the desire to end desire, right? You're going to have to have the purpose of ending purposivity. How do we think about that? Okay, well, there's a small number of purposes, and I, the Buddha, am going to tell you what they are. There's an eightfold path. Act like this, do these practices, blah, 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 right? And what are those things? Those are purposes. You got to commit to them. You got to embrace them. You got to, cling, attach to them, really hard. Like, it's like a raft. So you're like clinging to this raft and you'll drown if you don't. And you need to devote everything you have to that project, that raft. But what's the purpose of what justifies the use of it is its eventual planned obsolescence, its abandonment on the other shore.
but even if we kick the ladder down behind us, there's still a need for a ladder at a certain phase.
Yes, exactly. So
you're not flying into flying. You're
right, exactly. And interestingly, there, the justification for why how do we distinguish a good purpose from a bad purpose? So all of them seemingly are problematic, but there's one among them, this Buddhist path in the early Buddhism, that has this weird property of leading to its own self-overcoming, if I can put it that way. It's a ladder that leads to a place where you won't need ladders. It's a raft that leads to a place where you won't need rafts, the other shore. So interestingly, when you think about this, this applies in early Buddhism not only to practices, but to ideas, right? So we will even say in the Mahayana in the second stage, using that Tiantai schematization, we'll say, yeah, all the Buddhist teachings are like rafts. All possible statements are like rafts. And how do we know what are good rafts? Well, I mean, some things are just like stupid things to be clear. You're clinging to that tree over there, it's not getting you anywhere, right? But you cling to this raft, it'll float you across the river. You cling to this thing, it's just going to make you cling to more things. This thing will allow you not to. Interesting thing of that for our conversation a moment ago about truth is to say propositions are quote unquote true in the sense of valid insofar as eventually they will explode, that they will overcome themselves, that they will contradict themselves when pushed to their ultimate conclusion. This is important for Tiantai, right? I'm just trying to point out that it's already there in the most rudimentary Buddhism because of its weird attitude toward desire and purpose. Is that one, does that need more unpacking?
No, I mean, I don't know about needed, but so instead of just there being like these two tiers of truth, it's sort of like the raft and the shore. It's a rafts are all you got. It's like an Indra's net made of rafts, or like a qualia
Yes,
web of rafts.
we're going to get to an Indra's
Yeah,
net of rafts, exactly. But let's go a little slower, step by step, right? So even for propositions, even the statement non-self, right? Even emptiness, even
I
all.
guess one thing that could be so in terms of like things that would sound insane to some, but so it's like, for instance, like unity of opposites, like
Yeah,
or of necessity of
yeah,
yeah, of opposites. In terms of this can show up, at least in my experience, in both more like ways that speak to life, but I think but there's a deeper issue of like uh philosophical logical necessity. But like in terms of life, I think many people have had experiences seeing the truth of or not seeing the truth of like Taoism the hard way, of like grasping something too hard and then like you not getting it. So this sort of like and focusing on a goal so much that like the ground of what you needed was undermined. So this
mm,
kind of like way of like a lack of appreciation of context can like
yeah,
kick back on you. But there's like a deeper kind of like uh problematizing of category indifference also. It's not
yeah,
that's not just, but it's so this is both though. I think it's useful to say though, this is also practical wisdom. Like this is
yeah.
just like
Oh yeah,
like when
yes.
we go through the meat grinder of life and existence, like you rub up against these sorts of like paradoxical double bindy situations like all the freaking time. That's just like what it is to be a person among people.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So let's keep that in mind. That's why I want to remind you, it's not that dualism is bad for philosophical reasons. It's that it puts you in a double bind because whenever you embrace one side, it's haunted by the other side. It needs the other side to define itself. It's constantly bleeding into the other side. And even it goes a little deeper than that, right? Which is it is even positing the other side. This goes back to kind of Zhuangzi stuff, right? Just by taking a position, it's positing the other position from which it is the wrong position. I mean, and that's internal to it. So, I mean, I myself, maybe we'll get there a few steps down the line, but yes, that's where we're going. A deep um, paradoxicality, ambiguity plus ambivalence that goes all the way down. Now, what do you do about that, right? It can drive you crazy, but that is the nature of suffering, and it's going to be the kind of embrace, even the transformation of it from contingent to necessary, omnipresent, unconditional, inescapable that we're going here. Let me give you a couple more steps. All right. I think we can do this. I don't want to go forever on this, but okay. So now we have moving from step one to step two, we have the Four Noble Truths as unborn, as they'll put it. And that's the kind of Mahayana Nagarjuna position. All things are already nirvana, if only you could see it. Nothing really arises. And that also means in ultimate truth, all views are wrong, all stateable views. Okay, there aren't any cognitive truths to be stated about things that have no self-nature. However, we have illusions, obviously. That's why we think there's a difference between samsara and nirvana. That's why we suffer. And also we need them as rafts to get to that position. So there we still actually have the same problem, but kicked down the road a little bit, which is to say, now we have a dichotomy between seeing correctly and seeing wrongly. Either seeing
category of
everything
truth would be meaningless if there wasn't also the idea of illusion. Like
yeah.
it's truth.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, you're not really any better off in the sense that now you still got to work to reach the point of seeing that you've always been in nirvana. It's just that now what you discover when you get there has this kind of retrospective, oh, shit, that was totally unnecessary. I was standing here all along. But it's still conditional, just cognitively, for you to know that. So what does that mean?
Last time you mentioned a crocodile world of like the ways that like you get like mixed up in things, and like even that too is nirvana. Like, is that something you made up, or is there actually like a lizard world?
I can't remember that, but I do want to say, I mean, you know, the where this is going is to say
in the sutras, that is like
oh yeah, there's all kinds of different worlds, right? Where, you know, there's one thing that happens in the Mahayana where they'll say, you know, there are some worlds where the Buddhas don't even use words to preach. They just like sneeze or scratch their nose or roll around on the ground, and that's the preaching of the Dharma there, as in the Lankavatara Sutra. But there would, right, you know, and even, I don't have to go into the details, but I mean, this sort of explosion of multiplicity. But we'll get that in the next step, because here's what happens here is, so there's actually in the original two truths theory, but pre-tiantai, this is the so-called shared teaching number 2, you would say, okay, there's ultimate truth, and that's maybe it's experiential, maybe it's some kind of mystical vision or something, but there's nothing you can really, there are no true statements you can make about it. Even to say it's empty is merely a conventional truth. Even the practices like do these meditations and mindfulness, these are rafty things. They are a means to get there, but they are not descriptions of truths. Okay, they're pragmatic guidelines to action, which will lead you beyond the need for propositional truths. But that conventional truth theory also has a criterion and limit. So the criterion is only those kinds of speech acts and practices which are conducive to serving as a raft, which means which are conducive to overcoming themselves, to destroying themselves, are valid.
did they
So now,
basically
yeah,
didn't they basically like anticipate most of what Wittgenstein like
at this stage, yeah, and that's why there's a big attraction. There's a lot of confluence with Wittgenstein on two truths theory, right? Exactly. I think let me push it a little further though, right? Because that means, okay, what not every statement, just because there are no true statements doesn't mean there are no false statements on that model, which is weird, right? All statements are literally false. Some statements are conventionally true, and some statements are conventionally false. So what kind of statements are conventionally true? A, convention, right? Which means when I say I or you or cause or effect or table or chair, etc., right? In fact, all our knowledge, whatever, including I would say probably scientific knowledge, whatever works in the community for us to communicate and navigate our interactions, conventionally accepted speech is true. Why are valid? Why is it valid? Because without it, the Buddha can't say, you are suffering, here's the end of suffering, blah, blah, blah. Once I was in this place, all that kind of ordinary language. That's conventionally true. Also, Buddhism language is conventionally true, right? On this model. This is just stage 2.
conventional truth there. Was this at all in dialogue with the Confucian tradition in terms of or not?
Not yet. This is still in India. So and then, you know, there's a few extra things that aren't sort of just what everyone accepts in their ordinary language, like the Four Noble Truths, Nirvana Samsara, blah, 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 emptiness language. Those are all conventional truths, qua statements, right? What's not true? Metaphysical statements, non-empirical claims that on the judgment or the claim of the Buddhists don't lead to their self-obsolescence, to their self-overcoming, like God created the world. There is an absolute controller of things. You have an eternal soul. All things are made of atoms, da, 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 da. All these sort of claims that are meant to be universally applicable, that don't come with the escape clause that says this claim is to be discarded and its only valid use is to lead beyond itself.
Now I'm thinking of like Dewey and James and pragmatism and
Yeah, very close to that. And you will again see Madhyamaka scholars cotton to that quite a bit. Okay. Now move into the third one, and this is where the Bodhisattva comes in. So I'm sorry this seemed like a long digression. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. That was 2. There's a criterion, a limitation to conventional truth, and a complete empty kind of placeholder for ultimate truth. Bodhisattvas come into this, and of course they are the ones who are going to now see the emptiness of emptiness not simply as, okay, it's empty, but the word emptiness is also just a statement, so it's beyond even, don't even cling to emptiness. It's even more not nothing than emptiness. They don't go that way. This is the Tiantai reading, at least. They say emptiness means it can't have any self-nature. That means it can't exclude anything. And that means, as you said earlier, as you quoted scripture there, which is, without emptiness, nothing could exist. Nothing could be established. All things are established on the ground of non-dwelling. In other words, it's this, the projective power to create illusions is also due to emptiness. The reason we have delusions is also because of emptiness, because things are not secure. Things do not simply guarantee, state and guarantee their own natures. So there's an instability, a drift, an alternate interpretability at the root of things, topsy-turvy kind of chaotic flux in dependent co-arising. In a word, that emptiness is also creative. The emptiness of emptiness means a turn backwards toward conventional truth, because what do the bodhisattvas do? They create conventional truths. This is where emptiness becomes creative, if you like. Okay, because why do they do that? Because they go to see all these, the Bodhisattva vows, like there's 84,000 types of sentient beings, so there's 84,000 types of delusion. And for that reason, I have to create 84,000 types of Dharma gate. Okay, and which means in response to every specific delusion, they get born and reborn in all these different ways. They embrace illusory conditional existence, but they see that as rooted in this realization of the ultimate emptiness that is the nature of all things. But emptiness that is just remains emptiness isn't real emptiness.
So I'm gonna
right? This is the blank wall versus the mirror kind of idea, right? A total absence of determination cannot be the exclusion of all determinations, which would just be a determination like black, right? So the void, that is you thinking that doesn't have any features or qualities or characteristics, it would have to be even less determined than that, and that would be something more like a mirror, but a mirror is sort of passively reflecting, but something that can be any shape, any form, any characteristic, can be blank or non-blank. That's more blank than blank.
So,
okay.
Quick metaphysical diversion, and then an AI diversion. So the metaphysical one is, I was the other day listening to people talking about the idea of 0-point energy and like a quantum vacuum that's like fecund in terms of it's like it will not, like, to make it nothing is
it would require work, right? It would require restriction or constraint.
And so instead you're having this like seething chaos that gives birth to different types of forms. But I'm thinking in terms of like both the structure of biological intelligences and consciousness and also AI. There's this piece I'll link by Stuart Kaufman talking about like the frame problem and affordances and this like zone of adjacent possible where it's like where the genuinely new is going to come in, but where it can't be predicted in advance. And so, but in terms of
Yeah.
again, the practical relevance of these kinds of considerations, both in terms of like the nature of creativity, the nature of like creative problem solving, and also for how we might build systems that are intelligent in those ways, like being able to have like a period that's more indeterminate, that's more like even, not necessarily involving quantum physics, but quantum, if you will, involving something like a superposition of all sorts of different possibilities that allows you to basically to mirror in a way that gives you basically this open-endedness and the diversity where you can find something that works for that context, something
Yes,
cool. And so
exactly. So
these are
yeah,
live problems, and for instance, but these are problems in machine autonomy. These are for like, how do you get in like systems to be creative and intelligent in the ways you want them? This
yeah,
idea of dealing with like and leveraging a kind of open-endedness
yeah.
to get you a kind of as being part of situational appropriateness and intelligence.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely right. Yeah, no, totally. I think spot on relevant, right? Because the adjustments that happen at this level, the bodhisattva here are to say, a that limitation. Remember that the criterion to say, well, if I say, I am sitting on a chair, that's legit conventional truth. And then I can say, by the way, there is no chair, there is no me, there are in terms of their self nature. And then I can say just, nothing. That's the second model. The third model here is to say, well, wait a minute. If the only criterion was what can be conducive to leading beyond itself, to leading to its own obsolescence, to the revelation of its own non-self nature, why are those metaphysical claims even excluded? Or even, I'm sitting on an alligator, I'm sitting on Mount Olympus right now, right? Any of those mythological claims or even crazy claims, I'm sitting on this chair is actually made of bananas. Okay. In level 2, those would be laughed out of court, right? They're not conventionally true, and they're obviously not ultimately true because nothing is. Okay. But here, if by exactly the same criterion, but just expanded, because there is no way to limit the productive possibility. Once you limit it in any small way, it has become conditional again. So when the bodhisattvas are able to produce just through their own ingenuity and through the depths of their appreciation of this non-empty emptiness, which is to say, emptiness which isn't an exclusion but is the fertile void, right? Which is the allowing of any and every agency, impulse, desire to register and then find a response, and which could be any response. So now this is where we move sort of into Tiantai and into China. A work attributed to Nagarjuna, but that only exists in Chinese, called the Dazhi Du Lun, expands on the notion of two truths into this thing called I don't want to get too technical, the four Siddhantas, but one of the moves made there is to say, well, there's conventional truth, but there's also idiolect conventional truth, meaning the language, since the whole point of it is just a bodhisattva trying to liberate beings using whatever
The
possible means.
convention for my society of mind, or me across time, the me's.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we do this all the time, of course. You and I are talking in ways that are deeply informed by our many years and the specifics of our friendship. So, and there's a lot of, shorthand and other things I use, and maybe emphases I use differently when I talk to you than I talk to others, and everything. This is all going on all the time. But now this means, what if a bodhisattva has to liberate an insane person who's convinced that the world is made of bananas? Well, he's got to start from the assumption, say, all bananas are suffering or something, right? He's got to accept that premise and run with it and then tweak it.
I mean, any psychiatrist worth their salt would understand
Yeah,
that. Like,
exactly. Exactly. You enter the thought world of that person. and speech acts which are valid and liberating and therefore quote unquote conventionally true can then be anything. And that also includes the metaphysical claims. Now I can say, well, when God created you, blah, 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 or when, Xenu, this, whatever Scientology God or whatever, when he did that, the earlier conventional truth model would just say they're not part of conventional speech and they lead to no good. The bodhisattva must find a way to tweak them. And because even those beliefs themselves are empty, they can be tweaked, right? Which is to say, if they had a firm yes or no, oh, these are just absolutely unredeemable, cannot be made into vehicles that could lead beyond themselves and to their own overcoming, that would be a self-nature, actually. That would be a definitive essence, a sort of meta-level one. So given that the deepening of the insight into emptiness also expands this range, both of all those things are done by, if you like, emptiness, but also the response to them, tweaking them on the part of the bodhisattva is done through exactly that emptiness. Now you see that emptiness and conventional truth are weirdly kind of coming closer together, and conventional truth is expanding, just as emptiness expands to include conventional truth, right? Because it's a negation of the negation. It's empty of emptiness, meaning it can be full. But also there's no longer a limit on the range of conventional truth. So that's level 3. But this is done by agents. This is the other important thing about the bodhisattva, is that the kind of recoup.
And this for me though,
Yeah.
My concerns have always been wanting the soteriological aims of Buddhism to some the ability to help people to the extent that it's a good thing, transcend their suffering and flourish and be empowered in all sorts of ways. But to do that without flirting too much with nihilism.
Yeah.
So this seems to thread the needle and give you more of what you would need.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I totally agree. And I mean, but the way I tend to think of this is you gotta go all the way down into the cave of nihilism with Buddhism, right? And that's where it springboards really hard back this way. And this is where that's happening, right? So now it's going to be embracing all of those things. And I was going to say, the whole idea of the bodhisattva, is what we started with, is a recouping, a reaffirmation of the idea of desire, of projects. There's a fancy word for it, not purpose in this case, but vow. So you'll see a lot in Mahayana literature really going off the deep end about the vow, the bodhisattva vow. The moment of the vow, the bodhicitta, the moment of the aspiration for enlightenment is, worth 1 trillion worlds, is more valuable than enlightenment itself, is the mother of all Buddhas, and blah, 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 right? Because that moment, what is the kind of disambiguator of all this wild, unstable emptiness is some agent, some desiring being, for some reason, which we again talked about a little, we could talk about more, just made a vow. He said, I am going to become this being who, in whatever way is necessary, will acquire the power to speak in the language of all beings, to understand their suffering in all ways, to be empowered to respond and assist, and to transform into whatever form, any and every possible form. My true no self is now transformed through the vow to an multifarious self,
So
right? How can I not be a self? Because I, like Avalokiteshvara, can appear as a child or as a Brahmin priest or as a merchant or as a god or just some dude on the road, right? I got to be able to do that. That would be non-self, not having no self, right? Not the exclusion of all selves. So, but how do I do that? What's the turning point there? It's this thing called the vow. So there's where you get this kind of Promethean, kind of heroic moment, right? And it is very much like that, right? Because you can read this nice book called A Few Good Men by oh shit, I'm now forgetting, blanking. Please forgive me on her name. Great Buddhologist scholar, Jan, I believe, which is about the early conception of the Bodhisattva as, most Buddhists are doing the Arhat thing, or maybe doing the contemplation up to the of emptiness, but the bodhisattvas were just these extra special dudes. And this is where I got into the dolphin world thing in that book, right? Which is to say, initially they're presented as, okay, Four Noble Truths, suffering, here's what I'm here to tell you about. There's this other thing called nirvana. And maybe I'll start hinting that it's really just an illusion that you haven't reached there. But and in the little metaphor in that book is to say, it's like some guy said, life as a land creature sucks. Thank you for the plug.
Emptiness and omnipresence, an essential
All right.
introduction to Tiandai Buddhism.
Yeah, yeah. So the idea there was, um, I'm teaching you this method to escape suffering, but there's these guys, my little special helpers, and there's probably a hotel ballroom with 5,000 people in it, and you got three guys who are kind of the henchmen of the Buddha there saying, we want to escape life on land and live in the ocean because there the dolphins have it all figured out. They have this utopia. Get out of it. Believe me, don't try to fix this world on land. It's unfixable. That's samsara, right? It's hopeless. So, but fortunately, there's this completely other option. I've been there. I know how to get there. I'm going to teach you the method. You got to learn to breathe underwater and stuff like that, and we'll do it. And I have these kind of helpers with me because they're pretty close to my level. They've mastered it. I've taught them, but they're also going to learn everybody's language. So we're going to do one in Paris and speak French, and one in Russian, speak Russian. And I can't speak those languages at all at the same time. So I'm sending these guys, but there's only a couple of them, right? And then the fourth level, after all of that, so those guys are going around teaching. They're using like kindergarten methods of blocks and stuff to show, any way for every type of student. And the fourth level is this really weird Tiantai Lotus Sutra moment where it is revealed you're all bodhisattvas. So that special moment, the vow, the thing that made the bodhisattvas special. Once again, we have the typical Buddhist move where we make a sharp contrast and then we dissolve it. I always use the setup punchline model here, right? Which is to say, there's everybody else who are living in this world of ambiguous, total torture all the time. And then there are these few good men, the bodhisattvas, who make this vow, make this decision. It means they have to embrace all this stuff. They transform into every possible form. And they can liberate all beings that way. And they've deployed emptiness in this expanded way that the dualism between emptiness and conventional truth is eliminated, and the limitation of conventional truth. Now, Tentai's fourth final step is to say, A, there is no dolphin world. This is the dolphin world. What is the dolphin world? Is the bodhisattvahood the actual, all the things we said about how dolphins live are actually how the bodhisattvas live. Their ability to transform, their ability to communicate with and inhabit and even, internalize the diluted agency of every being and also a response to it. Okay, which is to say, seeing the way it leads beyond itself, the way even the delusions of sentient beings are upayas. This is a big move, which is to say, look, they have no self-nature, right? So you could never definitively say my stupid idea is either a bodhisattva response to my conditionality or is what a response is needed to. That last stage, that last dichotomy between the bodhisattva as the liberator and the sentient beings as the liberated is broken down. It's broken down in the same way all the other steps were. So now, the very indeterminacy or ambiguity, I'd prefer to say, of the bodhisattva's identity, where I am not really a 7-year-old child, but because you need to hear these words from a 7-year-old child, I'm going to appear to you as a 7-year-old child. I am that, I'm inhabiting that, I'm understanding it, I'm internalizing it, but I'm also able to transform into an 80-year-old man in the next encounter. But that relationship between who's deluded and who's enlightening, right? Since they are both things that just must lead beyond themselves, that have a root in the emptiness of emptiness and have a function, if properly tweaked, of leading beyond themselves and um, assisting other sentient beings, which might be you past, you future, you in your ambivalent other point of view. Zhili, great writer in the Tiantai tradition, will say, really, in every encounter, you have to be able to say, this is where what you were alluding to earlier, all four descriptions are going to be valid depending on the requirements upayically for liberating from an attachment. To say, I'm talking to you, you're the bodhisattva, I'm the deluded sentient being, or I'm the bodhisattva, you're the deluded sentient being, or I'm both the bodhisattva and the deluded sentient being, or you're both, or we're both deluded sentient beings, just messing, like making things worse, or we're both bodhisattvas saving each other.
Like when you say like this is a cup,
Yeah,
and it's like there's a sense in which it would be diluted in terms of if all you have to say about it is this is a cup, you're leaving a lot on the table. You're in fact leaving an infinite range of things on the table.
yeah.
But it's upaya, or like a skillful means that could be part of salvation or helping others, in that there might be, it's both like there is a context in which that actually might be a more relevant conventional truth or idiolect, but also in terms of the very process and the preconditions for the vow to mean anything, you're helping to the bodhisattva would not be able to manifest without having suffering to work with. Like you're like you're
yes, his own past suffering and the suffering of sentient beings, and even the reread fact of his own past bodhisattva.
And so that, and it's like the setup and the punchline. It's like when the punchline enters, the setup is revealed to have through it a kind of comedic quality that was there before the setup, but for the setup, for the punchline, but for the punchline to do its work and the setup to do its work, they also have to fully embrace, like the setup, its deadpanness, its non-comedicness, even though it will be revealed to be and folded into the overall recontextualization of the comedicness of it. And then and for the it's
yes, exactly. So right, I mean, so there's a certain sense in which you could say, okay, everybody's already a Buddha, everyone's already enlightened, but that depends on them not being enlightened, exactly as you say. Just as you need the contrast between the deadpan or seriousness of the setup of the joke for the funniness of the joke, of the punchline to work, and yet that funniness has the retrospective effect of saying, oh, actually it was funny, that setup was funny all the time, in the form of, see the bodhisattva move there, right? It's in the form of not itself that it's funny, right? And it has to really be not itself for a while, right? It's all about timing. That's what the skill of the bodhisattva is, like a stand-up comedian, right?
I mean,
But
so
it
like,
has to be both, right? And it does need suffering, but all suffering is also nirvana.
so
Right?
I used to just like I wanted things to be more straightforwardly simple, and I used to rage against you, but life taught me a few additional lessons since then. But in terms of like the applicability of this,
Yeah,
it's it ranges again from what are the preconditions for anything to be meaningful at all, in terms of like for there to be purposes, for there to be goals, but
yeah,
also like very pragmatically, like part of it, like what is it to be a person with a meaningful life and a decent person? Even like, for instance, like if you're talking to a child or you're talking to the 80-year-old man, like, there's a sense in which like humanness itself,
yeah,
the bodhisattva ideals in a way the limit case of like human benevolence in a way, and these challenges are challenges that are alive to us the whole way through, in terms
yeah,
of just even like garden variety, trying to be a person among other people, and to actually be a good to have a good impact of those relatings. Like there is a way of relating to meaning that like has the right grip, that has the right kind of like breathingness to it, that lets
yeah,
you actually have shared meanings and meet people where they're at, but
Yes.
also grow with them. Like, so this is this kind of structure of fluid meanings, that meanings that are both fluid that can take form as appropriate. Like, this is
Yes.
what we need, and but also this is what AI will need also. So this
Yes.
is like,
Yes. Yes. Beautifully said. And I mean, right. Let's just stress that maybe to wrap that up. It's like, right. Again, both vow and purpose and all those words are basically the word are just fancy words for desire, right? And that's the problem, but it's also the solution here. So, right, it's a story about you have contingent situatedness and desire and project. You can't get out of it by simply eliminating it. The first move to it is use it as a raft, like sort of enlightened self-interest way, you can figure out those few things. But from that move, you can see the way this kind of ramifies step by step, where my agency gets at the one hand on the one hand gets sort of diversified in this way, but it also means, to be an agent also means being able to um, under, grasp the way in which you are a patient. In other words, a receive on the receiving end. I mean, to be a seer is also to be able to, let's put it this way, to see well is to also be able to see that you are seen, and you are seen in an infinity of multiple ways.
I mean,
So
tell
rather than
me,
sort of the monolithic point of view that I'm just going to see things and give them identities, I see things, but I see them looking back at me and having their own agency, which um, implicates me, in a way where that theirs is just as contingent as mine, and yet the way to the kind of unconditioned or the absoluteness that transcends suffering, which is conditionality, is not, to deploy that old cliche, not out, not away, but through. And indeed, I mean, in Tiantai they like to say to dwell in it more fully. So to really dwell in your agency also means to sort of start to see the way your agency is implicated in all these alternate agencies, which are just as inalienably and inexcludable from you as the one you were sort of uh, pushing out from initially. You know,
just as
that's
giving
why I love those things. You may
kind of
remember.
empathy and gateway to common
Yeah,
sense. Actually, like, I
yeah.
think there might be even like a meta problem of common sense in AI, in terms of like,
Mhm.
we have so much trouble with it, but actually, when you get into like what's needed for it, it's actually very complicated.
Yeah,
And
to have common sense. Yeah,
I
right,
have like, what do we even mean by common sense? Like, when you start to
right.
look at it. But and so here there's a kind of like to do any sense making at all, especially for like uh and they're subjective social beings like us, like, are the way we bootstrap sense making is by taking on these other perspectives,
Yes,
like part
yes,
of the way we even do it developmentally, but and also what we'll need to do to coordinate with others in terms of like the real power, which is our high our collective mind that we share, like to get an on-ramp there, like, you are bringing on other perspectives, and unless you have a certain flexibility there, you don't
yes.
get the generativity and the coordination that is part of our intelligence and our
Yes.
precondition for being in the world.
So
Yeah.
tell me if this sounds right to you. I mean, trying to apply it, like the way AI works now, or Chat GBT or something, right? And one level, you might say, well, there it is. It's kind of a clearinghouse for all these different points of view, right? And then but it's sort of summing them, right? So you ask it a question, you're to some extent, I guess it's adapting to the maybe something in your question in some way, and taking all these, you know, kind of leveling all these points of view down into this form. That may be a point where we could start to maybe rethink other ways of doing that. Point one. Point two, what about the level of the understanding of what suffering is? Like, does ChatGPT have a way to understand what motivates the asking of a question? Why would anyone ask a question?
Yeah,
How well can you answer a question without understanding what makes people have questions? You know what I mean? So
Remarkably well, although for the kind of reliability we would want for like entrusting it with high stakes things, no. But
Yeah.
in terms of just like the way we tend to speak, like a lot of the pragmatics will be enfolded in a way like there seems to be a kind of like the way we tend to speak and the evolution of language allows for it to be somewhat forgiving in terms of like, you know, your attention drifts, what you're imagining or not. We're kind of like looking ahead. Wait, are they about to say this? Did they just say this? But then like the way, like, you know, why does next token prediction work so well? Part of it is like we speak in ways so that it can work so well, so that it can be a very powerful way of like chunking the semantics and organizing it. And so you can get probably a good amount of like pragmatics just because like that'll be useful to unfold that in when they can get access to like pragmatic contextualization in a kind of zombie or dumb way. I feel like that's a useful thing to do for, you know, distractible beings like us who are
Yeah.
race and a wiggle as we're co-hallucinating. So, but
Yes.
to really get like a deep understanding of the question and like, well, like a chain of, well, this, then this,
Yes.
and then like testing, wait, but then you thought this, but you didn't do that. That's not in ChatGPT's playbook.
Right.
However, a surprising though amount though of our whys and our pragmatics does get unfolded just because that is already unfolded in the way we speak.
Yeah. That's right.
The
That's
paper I'll
interesting.
find though that I think you'll find interesting is looking at, I think it was, yeah, ChatGPT as a superposition of agents. So
Yeah.
like basically a bunch of different kinds of agents all being
Yeah.
represented at once. And I think this would correspond to what you were saying there.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I just sort of worry about if whether there's a way in which that this purely quantitative summing, where things are weighted just in terms of the sort of quantitative incidence of occurrence, uh, is, I mean, just to map it out, you know, that's one thing, right? How adaptable it is to the specific situation. But the other thing that may come through, I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be this way, but you know, the other glaring exception I mentioned, the expansion of conventional truth to include idiolects, but there's another one in that same work attributed to Nagarjuna, and it's the reverse. Because after all, what is the justification for a true statement? It's not the model of correspondence to facts in the world, right? It's what can undermine an attachment and therefore suffering. So one of the other things a bodhisattva can do, he can say, oh yes, this world of bananas truly is created by the god Zenu. But by the way, here's what you ought to do in this world of bananas. But he can also say, no, the world isn't made of bananas. In other words, he can specifically contradict the presupposed beliefs. He can argue with you, right? Or he can say, you know, sort of Zen master style, he can just say, it is not a stick, slap, blah, 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 right? So that, of course, could be factored into something that some agents do, right? They disagree. But is there a way in which the function, in other words, where the positive and negative functions around a particular topic don't simply neutralize each other or weigh quantitatively, but you can have the negative one. In other words, I don't accept, I mean, I know ChatGPT does this sometimes. I'm really not in a position to answer that question, sir, kind of stuff, right? But are there, you know, if you really wanted to go onto a bodhisattva model, it would have to have a thing that it could say, here's what's wrong with the premises of your question, dude, right? And say, first of all, none of those things exist that you're mentioning. There is no Nashville mafia that you're asking, you know, something like that, right?
But if that conversation is in the
Yeah,
training data or something close enough to that, that like, for instance, the way in which you're speaking, there's like a stylistic resemblance even
yeah,
for that philosophical move that might be evoked if
it
the
might.
stylistic resemblance is enough and there's enough converging points. It might say like, then I remember this, you know, so you know, we're conditioning on a philosophical domain. Here's like available moves. This has a resemblance to this setup, and that was the. It might structure it that way, maybe.
Interesting.
But
Yeah.
one thing that's I should look into the details of, I think, is something so with the reinforcement learning with human feedback, you're trying to put this like pressure on having it to give you more of some answers rather than others, even like with some resemblance to this like a criteria of truth that ultimately being cashed out pragmatically. And there's something, I think it's called the maybe Waluigi effect. But it's kind of like Luigi, like the Mario Brothers character, like his like shadow character, like Waluigi. There seems to be actually a kind of representation of the inverse of what you desired
Yeah.
that is actually there latent, and that actually is somewhat co-sculpted along with trying to sculpt it in the in this positive direction. There's almost like a shadow version data structure that gets in there and that can also be evoked. And so I'll try to find that, because I think this actually would point to a lot of the things you're saying in terms of like a constitutive inescapability of a certain contradiction.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it may be interesting even to
Probably.
try to design experiments with ChatGPT to like ask it questions with faulty premises, and see what it does with those.
But a thing from before I don't want to forget is
Yeah.
the nature of this vow.
Yeah.
Um, it seems like it might be difficult to think about that too much. Like in terms of both like
Yeah.
the work that it can do, like transformationally, but also in a way, what are the preconditions that would be required to actually be able to do something like that kind of speech act, that kind of stance
Yeah.
adjustment that could have that force? What's
Yeah.
assumed, like what kind of agents or beings could do that
Yeah, I know.
ourselves, and maybe in time for increasingly advanced systems with basically something like the bodhisattva ideal,
Yeah.
the vow being something like the ideal of human benevolence,
Yes.
something we'd
It,
want to
it,
recapitulate.
it's a really rich area actually to investigate. I mean, and I like some of the work you've shown me and various people are doing, thinking about that, the thinking about the bodhisattva vow, the moment of making the vow. And I'll just say this about it. I mean, yes, there's a lot to unpack in that, like how that's supposed to operate, what its effects are. I mean, psychologically, even logically, how it works. Um, and there are very interesting resources. I mean, you can read stuff in, Shanti Deva is a good source for this, but also some Mahayana sutras. But the interesting thing about that also, to give it a Tiantai twist, is when we get to that fourth level, of course, what happens in the Lotus Sutra is they say, hey, you Shravakas, you non-bodhisattvas, you already took the bodhisattva vow and you just don't know it. Okay, which changes the valence of that vow completely, because it means you can be a bodhisattva without knowing it, and the vow is assumed to still be in effect even when it is forgotten, and that means part of the vow might include your ability to forget the vow. And of course, their claim there in the Lotus Sutra, as they read it, is to say sometimes to fulfill the vow, you need to forget the vow, and you need to even be, just like you're transforming into a little girl and an old man, you got to transform into a non-bodhisattva specifically. That's a Shravaka, right? And that means you got to inhabit his world. And now this gives us a little more information about what it means to inhabit a world. I really don't know I'm a bodhisattva anymore. And again, this maps on existentially, everyday life kind of level. Yeah, you may take the vow and then forget all about it 10 minutes later, right? On the Lotus Sutra reading, that is now also part setup punchline way, the deadpan version of your fulfillment of the vow. It also means there doesn't have to be, and in a way, I would say the radical Tiantai reading is there can't ever be just a moment when someone sits down and makes the vow. The vow is something all creatures have already made. If you want the ontological version of the vow, that means just desire itself is the bodhisattva vow. Gets closer to what you were saying before about being a person, right? But the bodhisattva vow, the Lotus Sutra, right, is the moment when the punchline happens, when you see, oh, what I was calling desire this whole time has actually been the bodhisattva vow. It's not the actual making of the vow, it's the recognition of the inescapability of the vow, maybe. Something like that. So that's Tiantai, right? I mean, that's where they get really weird, and they're a bit of an outlier in general Mahayana philosophy on this issue specifically, right? you can be a bodhisattva by not being one, and the vow is something that has always already taken place.
In terms of like, I guess my own life, um, like there's a sense in which, like, for instance, the ways in which I've made mistakes and suffer and been deluded, to the extent that like it hasn't at points made me different degrees of solipsistic, is a gateway. Is like how Leonard Cohen, like how the light gets in. Like there's like a gateway to understanding. Like someone else tells me, I'm suffering in this, and this way, and I can say like I feel you, and I mean it. And so it was part of it, like the
Yes.
but this inescapability. Still that's not going far enough. That's still like a pragmatic utility, or but it's not like there's a constitutive sense
Yes.
which I could not have avoided taking the vow, because once the vow is understood in terms of a having the qualities that are being ascribed to it, of being unconditioned in these ways,
Yes.
in order for it to be able to do that work and to have that kind of semantics, it has to be self-undermining, because if it's acknowledging a distinction, there's this moment where I took the vow versus not. Well,
Yeah.
now we're bounding it, we're placing all these causes and conditions, and now it too is suffering. It
Yeah.
too is a threatened menace thing, and
Yeah.
also is dualistic, and all the things that it was rejecting are like part of it,
Yeah.
unless you give it this self-undermining quality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, and it embraces all that dualism and that suffering, but right, with the additional recognition. Yeah, we don't say no need for a vow. We just say the vow has always already is already happening in the form of the non-vow. That's all. Right. That's the interesting thing, right? You don't just say no self. You say yes, no self, yes, but also that doesn't exclude its selfing, its sort of endless selfing, and that's the suffering of it having to happen, or at least the moment of having to realize it, is in this setup punchline form, where it's not that I just sit down and draw a clear line. I wasn't a bodhisattva, now I am. It's that there is a thing that still has to happen, the punchline, which for them is the Lotus Sutra, or, the Buddha in the Lotus Sutra says, well, here's the big revelation. I told you I've only been a Buddha for 40 years. Actually, I've been a Buddha for a trillion years, right? And what they take that to mean is all those times when I was not a Buddha, that was being a Buddha in the form of not being a Buddha, right? So I still have to do this thing where I become a Buddha, or where I read the Lotus Sutra, or even the Lotus Sutra will lower the requirement just to taking joy for one instant in this idea we're discussing now, and not even believing it, but just saying, oh, wow, yeah, that would be cool if only that were true. Done deal. You've just like punchlined the rest of the
You made
universe.
it nirvanic just then. Just
Yeah,
that
yeah,
one.
yeah. Just that little flicker of pleasure, just like, oh, yeah, right, if only. Anyway, right? That's enough. So, because it's all about recontextualization, I mean, maybe we've gone a little long here. Maybe we can go into that thing a bit more another time. But you know, ambiguity and recontextualization. I mean, that's the heart of the whole. I don't know if you want me to just say it in two sentences, but I mean, emptiness means ambiguity here, right? Which means no, never lacking some identity, because everything's already in some context. It's always embedded in a background, but also no fixed identity, no definite identity. And even since multiple contexts are always encompassing one another, always superimposed on each other, any given thing without changing in the least is at the same time all these different things. Duck, rabbit, right? If it's always duck, it's always rabbit. And duckness entails it's also being rabbit, like equilateral, equiangular triangle. Now I am compressing things quickly because I think we should finish.
Is we should come back to them. It's good to have it
Yeah.
now. And the
Okay. We'll come
uh,
back to it. Another one.
the it seems like it's so I do believe there are actually some of the enduring problems of artificial intelligence. This does like speak directly to them actually in some ways, in terms of like the frame problem, the relevance problem. What is actually like some of the core challenges of AI, I think are being dealt with here in terms of like the nature of agency and sense making. But the details here, that I'm hoping we can, and the questions I'm hoping we can find some more purchase on is, what degree the beneficial or the soteriological, the having to do with salvation parts of Buddhism, of the Dharma, like to what degree can they be brought to bear for alignment of ourselves with what we think we want and for such systems, but also this line between not too much and not too little flexibility,
Yeah.
like still having the right grip on existence, where we're in communities of where conventional truths
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
still being respected in the ways we need for beings like us, while at the same time trying
Yeah.
to get this flexibility of mind and this openness of self, while at the same time we have a self that's closed enough that it can do the job you want self to do, but open enough that it can do the jobs you want self to do. And so these are like these are the lines being walked here. And so I'm
Yes,
going to get greater purchase on that.
yeah, yeah. Okay. I like that way of putting it a lot. And this will be very familiar to you, Adam, but you know, landing up in that three truths position, we had conventional ultimate truth, but I think once we have emptiness just as ambiguity and recontextualization, um, I find it useful to speak of now, instead of speaking about conventional truth, we speak about local coherence, right? And emptiness as global incoherence, meaning the illimitability of contexts which change the identity, any coherent identity, and the third truth of intersubsumption really being that local coherence just is global coherence, and there is no other kind of coherence, and there is no other kind of incoherence. Importantly, every incoherence is coherent locally to some local context as well, and so maybe to get to your question, the way I would envision that is to say, nothing doesn't come with some context that makes it coherent, but it needs a context to make it coherent, which means there's going to be a local set of mutually dependent truths. This is the getting a grip part, right? Which is there's a lived world, there's an embodiment, there's a set of presuppositions, there's a familiarized context, and without it, there wouldn't even be a thing, right? There can't be any coherent entity there without a bunch of stuff that comes with it and is sort of on the same plane within a single kind of system with it. However, local coherence means it doesn't have a sharp boundary. It's dependent on that coming withness, also means it can't limit more stuff that will undermine those identities. So what you want there, that balance you're talking about, is there's an internal consistency, predictability, kind of familiarity, groundedness. But its open-endedness is not added to it from outside. It is open-ended. It has these horizons that don't have a sharp boundary. But that's not, I would say, to me, what's useful about this model is that it's not that, okay, it's there, it simply is what it is, and then there's these external forces that come and mess it up from outside. Its being there, as we said earlier in this conversation, as a coherent thing, is already dependent on its situatedness in a context of these stabilizing, but themselves never ultimately stabilized things. So what makes it coherent is also what makes it not ultimately coherent, right? What this was the Merleau-Ponty quote we alluded to, I think, last time, right? What centers our world at all is what keeps it from being completely centered. And so we have, the third truth in Tentai is seeing those two facts, which seem to be kind of in tension, and even the tension, like setup and punchline, as really synonyms as well, right? So it's going to be there, definite, and it comes with its life world, its habitat. But that being in a habitat is also an openness to it's always already having been a different thing that was being in that habitat, and that's something that transforms that habitat or relates or communicates, or transformatively communicates with other coherences in other habitats. That's what I think is really nice about it, which is to say you've got to have internal consistency and a full commitment to emptiness at once, right? Which means this conversation is going to make sense to us because everything we say in it comes with this sort of nimbus of contextualizing factors that sort of situate it for us. But it's not like we would have to clear those out to get this to go beyond the meaning that it already has. It having a meaning and it having more meanings are the same thing. You know, the prosaic and the poetic, if you like, right, converge. Its literal meaning, its infinite metaphorical meanings, let's say. Now I am riffing a little too quick, but just let it sit like that, I guess.
And we'll dig in more next time. So
Let's do that. Let's pick this up, and we can get into more of these sort of concrete, on the ground, maybe anecdotal stuff, East Asian stuff too, if you like.
that yes. So
All right. Sounds like a plan. It's a pleasure, always.
always.